All right, team, here we go. Let's talk about animal form and function, or another way of putting it, anatomy and physiology of animals. So when we think about anatomy and physiology, anatomy is the study of the structure, the physical form of a part of an animal or a plant, but we're focusing on animals in this unit. Versus physiology is the function of that specific part of the animal. And the way certain parts of an animal are structured, its form, can give us clues as to its function, as to what role it plays, right? So the morphology, the shape of an animal over its organ systems, its tissues, are going to give us some hints and some information on what that purpose, what that function of that structure is. Okay? And so as we dive into the rest of this unit, this chapter and beyond, so something that we're going to be coming back to is the interconnection of form and function. And one thing that's really important to point out that may not be necessarily obvious is that physical laws that govern our world, our universe, also govern animal shape, right? So organisms are at the whim of those same physical laws as other things in our universe. And then I want to pose a question to you really quickly. Why are there no single-celled organisms that are the size of the mountain from Game of Thrones? Huge, massive, single-celled, like an amoeba or something, right? Why is that not the case? And the reason why that's not the case is because a single-celled organism has to be able to exchange materials with its environment across its plasma membrane. Its entire surface, this plasma membrane, is in contact with the outside environment, and that's where it brings in food, that's where it brings in gases that it needs, that's how it brings in any sort of other nutrients it might need, or it gets rid of waste. Okay, so waste is also excreted to that surface through that plasma membrane. And so most single-celled organisms, like this amoeba right here, tend to be fairly small, because the smaller the single cell is, you have a really high ratio of surface area, the surface area of that plasma membrane of that one cell. You have a high ratio of surface area compared to the internal volume, right? So if we think about an organism that's diploblastic, like a cnidarian, for example, they only have 2 tissue layers. All of their cells are still able to be in contact with the external environment, whether it's the cavity, the gastrovascular cavity on the inside, or it's the external environment on the outside. And so being diploblastic means that they can still exchange materials with their outside environment, right? But now, most of the animals that we've talked about are triploblastic. So they're going to have 3 tissue layers. So there's that middle layer that is not in contact with the environment at all. And even the inside layer is usually only in contact with the digestive system and those internal organs. So how do these triploblastic, multicellular, large organisms, how do they exchange materials? How do they bring in food? They bring in gases. How do they bring in anything that they need? And how do they exchange waste with the environment? And the way that multicellular animals have been able to maintain homeostasis through exchange of materials, whether it's getting rid of gas or bringing in food or whatever, is they've now taken that surface area that they need to exchange materials and they've internalized it. They've internalized it through extensive branching and folding of their internal organs. So in this generic animal, think of a tube inside of a tube, right? So in our digestive system, we have extensive folding. You can think about how wrapped up it is inside of our small intestine is, inside of our bodies. It's coiled up, so that way we can have a high surface area. And then even then, on the inside of that, the lining of our small intestine, we have all these microvilli, all these tiny little finger-like projections that are also cells that help to increase the surface area of that digestive system. So instead of having all of our cells in contact with the outside environment, we're increasing the surface area of our cells internally, of our tissues internally. So now, instead of exchanging materials directly with the outside environment, these multicellular organisms are using something called an interstitial fluid And so this is fluid that fills up all the spaces between cells in that extracellular matrix area. This is what fills up all that spaces between the cells, and the cells can exchange their materials with this interstitial fluid. They can put their waste in there and they can bring in whatever they need. And then that interstitial fluid is going to be filtered out, it's going to be replenished using all of the internal organ systems of a multicellular animal. And the main purpose of the internal organ systems in the interstitial fluid is to maintain homeostasis within the animal. And without homeostasis, without keeping parameters within a very specific range, whether it's pH or temperature or gas concentration, no homeostasis, no life. Okay? So the whole purpose of most internal organs is to maintain a state of homeostasis, so that way these cells and tissues and organ systems and overall organism can remain alive. No homeostasis, no life. And the way organisms determine what's going on, the way they can sense what's happening in different areas of the body, in different regions of the interstitial fluid or tissues or organs, is nervous system is one of the fastest ways that they can detect information that's happening internally and externally. So the nervous system, composed of nervous tissue, sends really quick electrical signals that are going to have immediate specific effects. So we can detect what's going on both internally and externally with this nervous system tissue. Gets into the brain decides what to do. The other way that animal systems use for coordination and control, it's going to be the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is also controlled in many ways by the nervous system, but it's a longer lasting but slower acting system. It's going to have a wide ranging effect. It's going to take a little bit longer to kick in, but again, its main purpose is to alter the function of different organs, of different tissues. Same thing with the nervous system. Its purpose is to alter the function of different organs and tissues in order to maintain homeostasis for that organism. And how does this work? So for most homeostatic mechanisms in most organisms, in most animals, they're going to be using what's called negative feedback. So negative feedback is this idea that one homeostatic measure is going to be set at a certain point. We call that certain point the set point. So for example, body temperature. Most animals have a very specific body temperature. If they get too cold or too warm, that's bad. So their set point is their average body temperature. Let's say we are out running or something and it's really hot outside. We're doing a lot of physical activity. What's going to happen to our body temperature? Our body temperature is going to increase. It's going to get out of that set point range. And so what happens? Well, our nervous system, there's specific interosensory nerves that are going to be detecting that change in body temperature. They send that information to our brain, especially our hypothalamus. Hypothalamus says, oh shoot, we're too hot. Let's kick in our system to start sweating, and that evaporative cooling will get us back down to our set point. Okay, and vice versa. If we detect that we're too cold, our nervous system detects that we're too cold, we're below our normal set point, that nervous system sends the information to our hypothalamus in our brain. Hypothalamus says, all right, let's start shivering. And so we start to shiver, because that action of shivering causes muscle contraction, which basically what we're doing is we're burning up energy in our muscles. In the process of burning up energy generates heat. And so that brings us back up. And then that system kicks off once we're back to our set point. If we're above or below, once we get back to that set point, the system kicks off, right? So that's what's called negative feedback. Once we return to the set point, whatever process was in function in order to get us to that set point then stops until we get out of that set point again. There are some processes that use a process called positive feedback, but these are not necessarily to maintain homeostasis. Positive feedback is better for driving a process to completion. Okay? And so if we think about how animals use energy, animals are going to use energy in different ways. They're going to use it some animals are endotherms, they're going to use their basal metabolic rate in order to maintain a constant body temperature regardless of the external environment. Some are going to be ectotherms, and they're going to have a basal metabolic rate that's a lot lower because they're not using their energy to maintain a constant body temperature. They use behavioral mechanisms to keep within a very specific range. All animals have a very specific energy budget, and where they spend that energy, whether it's for maintaining body heat, is it for reproduction, is it for regenerating new cells, is it for growth, is it for development, that energy budget is going to be different for each animal. And it depends a lot also on the general shape of the animal, the general size of the animal. So many things can affect that basal metabolic rate. This is specifically just looking at endotherms, because endotherms have a much higher overall basal metabolic rate than we do in ectotherms. Indeed, in ectotherms, we call the basal metabolic rate, actually we call it the standard metabolic rate, because they don't have a specific minimum metabolism that they're going through to maintain body temperature. Their metabolism is going to fluctuate based on their environment, based on if they're warm or they're cold. So in endotherms, organisms that are using their basal metabolic rate to maintain a constant internal body temperature, there's going to be many things that can influence the metabolic rate, the BMR, the basal metabolic rate of that organism. So if we look at this graph right here, so here we have a shrew. A shrew is a small rodent-like mouse thing. And then this is on our y-axis, we have the basal metabolic rate that's measured in the liters of oxygen used per hour per kilogram. And then on the bottom right here, our x-axis is body mass. Right? So look at this relationship. So shrews have a really high BMR compared to something like an elephant that has a really low BMR. Okay, so size in endotherms is one of the biggest things that determines their basal metabolic rate, because the smaller you are, like we talked about earlier with the cells, the smaller you are, the more surface area you have compared to your volume. And so the more surface area you have, you're going to be losing more energy, more heat to the environment. You're going to be losing a greater amount of heat to the environment the smaller you are, because you have a greater surface area compared to your internal volume. And then compare that to something massive like an elephant. Elephants are huge, right? So their surface area to their volume ratio, they have a very small surface area compared to their overall volume, so they're losing less heat to their environment. So they don't have to spend as much of their basal metabolic rate to maintain that body heat, even though they are so much larger, right? So that's a general overview of animal structure and function. And we'll come back to these ideas of form and function that are going to be tied together as we go through the different body systems.